A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This abridged version is from the Hindley Reading Library Illustrated Classics Collection. Read for you today by Melissa Abrams. Stave I, Chapter 1, Ebenezer Scrooge. Jacob Marley was dead. Everyone knew that. There was no doubt about that. All the official papers were properly signed by witnesses to make them legal. The clergyman signed the papers. The city clerk signed them. And the undertaker signed them. Even Ebenezer Scrooge signed them. And everyone knew that anything Scrooge signed had to be perfectly legal. Yes, Marley was as dead as a doornail. Did Scrooge know he was dead? Of course he did. How could he not know? After all, Scrooge and Marley had been business partners for many years. Besides, Scrooge was the executor of Marley's estate, as decreed in his will. Scrooge was Marley's only friend, his only mourner, and the only beneficiary of his estate. Still, Scrooge was an excellent businessman, and even on the day of Marley's death, he took advantage of the sad event by offering his customers special bargains. Yes, Scrooge knew without a doubt that Marley was dead, but for some reason, which no one knew, he never painted old Marley's name out of the sign that stood above their warehouse door. It still read, Scrooge and Marley. But Scrooge was a tight-fisted old man, squeezing every penny out of a bargain, showing no mercy to those who owed him money, and wrenching every minute of work out of his employees. Yes, he was a cold, solitary old man, cold inside and cold outside. His cold heart froze every feature about him. His pointed nose, his shriveled cheeks, his red eyes, his thin blue lips, his wiry chin, and his harsh, grating voice. He even kept everything around him cold. His office was as cold as ice and never felt the slightest warmth, not even at Christmas. But neither heat nor cold bothered Scrooge. Neither did people. Nobody ever smiled at him in the streets. Nobody ever asked, "My dear Scrooge, how are you?" Nobody ever offered, "Why don't you visit us?" No beggars came up to him to plead for a trifle. No children ever asked him what time it was. No man or woman ever came up to him to ask directions. Even blind men's dogs led their masters off into doorways and up side streets when they saw Scrooge coming. And did Scrooge care? No, he actually liked this. He went through his life warning all people to keep away from him. Stave I, Chapter 2, Visitors to the Warehouse. It was the afternoon of Christmas Eve, and old Scrooge sat busy at work in his office. It was a cold, foggy, bleak day, and Scrooge could hear people in the street outside breathing heavily and stamping their feet on the stone pavement to keep warm. Even though it was only 3 o'clock, it was already dark, and candles were beginning to appear in the windows of nearby offices. The fog outside was so thick that it seemed to seep into the office through every keyhole and every slight opening in the walls. The door to Scrooge's office was open so that he could keep an eye on his clerk writing letters in his tiny office. In Scrooge's own office, a small fire burned, but the one in the clerk's office was so much smaller that it seemed to have only one coal burning. Still, the poor clerk couldn't refuel the fire, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own office, and even threatened to fire the young man if he dared come in to ask for more. So Bob Cratchit, the clerk, tried to warm himself at the candle that burned at his table, but he did not succeed. Suddenly, a voice interrupted Scrooge in the midst of his work. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle!" came a cheerful voice. It was Old Man Scrooge's nephew, Fred, a handsome young man with sparkling eyes and a glowing face. "Bah!" said Scrooge, without lifting his head. "Humbug!" "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said the young man. "You can't mean that." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas, indeed. What right do you have to be merry? You're poor." "Come, Uncle," said Fred gaily. "What right do you have to be grouchy? You're rich." And since Scrooge had no answer at the moment, he said, "Bah," and followed it with, "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said Fred. "What else should I be," said Scrooge, "when I live in a world filled with fools? What's so merry about Christmas? It's a time for paying bills when you don't have any money. It's a time when you're a year older and not a penny richer. If I had my way, every fool who goes around saying Merry Christmas would be boiled in his own Christmas pudding. Why, I wouldn't care if Christmas never ever came again." "Uncle!" cried his nephew. "What a dreadful thing to say! Christmas means so much. First, it is a sacred religious time. And then, too, it is a time for forgiving, a time to be charitable and pleasant. It is the only time when people seem to think of others so freely and open up their hearts to each other." From the other office came the sound of the clerk applauding. Then, realizing immediately what he had done, Bob Cratchit busied himself poking at the remaining coal in the fire and extinguishing the last spark. "If I hear another sound from you," Scrooge called out to his clerk, "you'll celebrate Christmas by looking for a new job." "Don't be angry, Uncle," said Fred. "I simply came to invite you to have Christmas dinner with us tomorrow." "Why, I would rather see you down below with the devil first than come to your house." "But why, Uncle? Why?" "Why did you get married?" "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge. "Bah! That's the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. Now leave me, sir. Good afternoon." "But, Uncle, you never even came to see me before I was married. Why are you giving my marriage as a reason for not coming?" "I said good afternoon," said Scrooge sternly. "I am truly sorry from the bottom of my heart, Uncle. We have never had a quarrel. I have tried to keep the spirit of Christmas, and I will to the end. So, Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good-bye," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year," called Fred. "Good-bye." Fred left the room, still smiling. He stopped at the outer door to wish a Merry Christmas to Bob Cratchit, who returned the greeting as he let the young man out the door. At that moment, two rather stout gentlemen with books and papers in their hands appeared at that same door, asking to see Scrooge. Bob Cratchit showed them into Scrooge's office. They bowed as a greeting to Scrooge. One of the men consulted his list and asked, "Is this Scrooge and Marley's?" Scrooge nodded. "Am I speaking to Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" continued the man. Mr. Marley has been dead for 7 years, answered Scrooge. In fact, 7 years ago tonight. Well, then, I am certain that you, as his partner, Mr. Scrooge, will want to be as generous as he was in donating to the charity we represent. Upon hearing the word generous, Scrooge shook his head, for he knew that Marley was no more generous than he was. But the man seemed to pay no mind to Scrooge's negative shake of his head, and he took up a pen from Scrooge's desk and explained, At this festive time of the year, we try to help the poor and destitute who are suffering. There are many thousands who do not have even the bare necessities of life, sir. Bah! Replied Scrooge. There are prisons and workhouses to take care of these people, and laws made by the government to see to their welfare. As far as I'm concerned, the government is looking after them well enough. But, sir, said the man, we wish to bring a little extra cheer to these unfortunates. We are raising money to buy some food and drink and a little warmth. At this time of the year, everyone rejoices in giving. Now, how much of a donation may I put you down for? Nothing, replied Scrooge. Ah, you wish your gift to be anonymous? Asked the gentleman, smiling. I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. I do not consider Christmas merry, and I have no desire to make idle, worthless people merry. Their welfare is not my problem. I have my own business to attend to, and I do not concern myself with other people's business. Now, good afternoon, gentlemen. But, sir, began the gentleman, there is never enough government support for these poor people, and many will die. Bah! Humbug! Exclaimed Scrooge. Then let them die. We already have enough of a surplus population of these wretched creatures anyhow. Realizing that they could do nothing to move the old man, the two gentlemen left, and Scrooge returned to his work, feeling quite pleased with himself. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness had thickened outside, and the cold had become more intense. In the street, across from the warehouse, some workmen, who had been repairing a gas line in the road, had lit a fire in a bucket, and a group of ragged men and boys gathered round it to warm their hands. The dancing fire and their good spirits soon prompted one old man, his voice cracking, to sing the first few bars of God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. Soon other voices from these ragged men and boys joined in. One young lad, his nose frozen and numb from the cold, left the group and crossed the street to the Scrooge and Marley warehouse. He stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to sing some lines of the Christmas Carol to him. But at the first sound of God rest ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay, Scrooge seized his ruler and shook it toward his closed door so violently that the singer jumped back from the keyhole and fled in terror. By now it was closing time at the warehouse. Scrooge got down off his stool and announced it to Cratchit. The clerk immediately blew out his candle and took his hat and long woolen scarf down from the hook. "And I suppose you'll want tomorrow off," said Scrooge to the young man. "If it is convenient for you, sir." "It is not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it is not fair either. If I wanted to dock you a day's wages from your pay, you'd think I was being unfair, wouldn't you?" The clerk smiled weakly. "And yet," continued Scrooge, "you don't think it unfair that I should pay you a day's wages for no work?" "But it's only once a year, sir," pleaded Cratchit. "Yes, once a year, Every 25th of December, said Scrooge. It's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket, making me pay you for staying home. Well then, Cratchit, you'd better be here earlier on the following morning. Oh, yes, sir, promised the young man. With that, Scrooge buttoned up his coat, slammed on his hat, and walked out growling. Stave I, Chapter 3, Marley's Ghost. Scrooge stopped at his usual tavern, took his usual table, and ate his usual melancholy dinner. No other customers greeted him, and he greeted none of them. He passed the time reading all his newspapers and checking his bank books. And when all the papers had been read, and all the bank books checked, Scrooge went home to bed. Scrooge lived in the apartment that once belonged to his partner, Jacob Marley. It was a gloomy old place in a small building that was now surrounded by other larger ones. The building was such a dreary one that no one chose to live there, so the other rooms were rented out as offices. The front courtyard was dark in the fog and frost as Scrooge entered the gate and walked to the door. As he inserted the key in the lock, his eye caught a glimpse of the large, shiny brass knocker on the door. It was the same knocker he had been seeing morning and night for all the years he lived in the building. But suddenly, tonight, it was not a knocker that stared back at him from the door. No, it was the face of Jacob Marley. But Jacob Marley is dead, thought Scrooge, frozen to the spot. My eyes must be playing tricks on me, just because of those visitors I had this afternoon, those two men seeking charity. My thoughts returned to Marley, quite by chance. Now, Scrooge stared harder at the knocker. Here was Marley's face, with a dismal light around it. Marley's face, with ghostly spectacles raised on its ghostly forehead. Marley's face with hair blowing strangely and wildly about his head. Marley's face with eyes wide open and bulging, but not moving. As Scrooge stood there, unable to tear his gaze from the door, the strange vision became a knocker again. Did I imagine that vision in the knocker? He asked himself, with his heart thumping nervously. But since he could find no answer, Scrooge forced himself to turn the key in the lock and walk inside. Yes, he decided, he must have imagined it all. Still, before he shut the door, he looked carefully behind it as if he half expected to see Marley. But there was nothing, only the screws and nuts that fastened the knocker to the door. "Pooh, pooh!" cried Scrooge, slamming the door with a bang. He was angry with himself as he lit his candle and climbed the stairs to his room. Although Scrooge had always liked the darkness, now, as he entered his apartment, it made him remember Marley's face in the knocker. He walked nervously from room to room, first with his candle held high, then poking it into corners and under furniture. Nobody was under the table. Nobody was under the sofa. Nobody was under the bed. Nobody was in the closet. Scrooge even looked inside his dressing gown as it hung on the hook on the wall. But nobody was inside it either. A small fire was in the grate. A little pot of broth was warming on the fireplace ledge. Satisfied that he was alone, Scrooge closed and locked his door, which he didn't normally do. Then, taking off his coat and jacket and putting on his dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap, Scrooge sat down before the fire to eat his broth. The fire was low, very low for such a bitter night. As Scrooge moved closer to get every bit of warmth from it, he looked at the familiar tile set into the fireplace around the hearth. He remembered remarking to himself when he had first moved in that the fireplace must have been built by a Dutchman years ago, for the tiles were old Dutch scenes illustrating the Bible. But now these scenes were suddenly gone, and in their place appeared the shape of old Marley's head staring out at Scrooge from each smooth tile. "Humbug!" cried Scrooge angrily as he jumped up and strode across the room. After a few minutes of pacing, Scrooge returned to the fireside and sat down again. As he leaned his head back against the chair, his eyes were raised, and his glance came to rest on a bell. It was a bell that had always been in the room, a bell that had hung there unused. Now, suddenly, this long, silent bell began to swing. Scrooge stared, first with astonishment, then with terror. At first, the bell swung softly, barely making a sound, but soon it rang out loudly and was followed almost in a chorus by every bell in the house. The ringing may have lasted a minute, but to Scrooge it seemed like an hour. Then suddenly the bells stopped. Just as Scrooge was about to catch his breath, a new sound gripped his heart, a clanking noise from deep down below, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain over the wine casks stored in the basement. With a shudder, Scrooge recalled having heard that ghosts in haunted houses drag chains and that. At that moment, Scrooge heard the cellar door fly open with a bang. It was followed by the sound of the dragging chain coming up the stairs. Up, closer and closer to his door. "It's humbug!" cried Scrooge. "I won't believe it!" But no sooner were the angry words out of his mouth than his face went white. His eyes popped and his jaw dropped open in amazement. For coming through the heavy locked door was Jacob Marley, or rather his ghost. There was no doubt, for it was Jacob Marley's pigtail, his usual waistcoat, his tights and boots, and he was dragging a chain that was wound around his waist. But what a strange chain it was, made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledger books, and heavy steel purses. Marley's body was transparent, so that Scrooge, looking at him, could see right through to the 2 buttons at the rear of his coat. As he raised his head, Scrooge met the death-cold eyes of the ghost as they stared back at him. "Well now," said Scrooge coldly, "what do you want with me?" "Much." It was Marley's voice. "Who are you?" demanded Scrooge. "Ask me who I was," replied the ghost. "Who were you, then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley," said the ghost, as he sat down in a chair alongside the fireplace. Then he turned to stare directly into Scrooge's eyes and said flatly, "You don't believe in me." "I don't," said Scrooge. "What proof do you need that I am real?" asked the ghost. "You see and hear me." "But my sight and hearing could be affected by an upset stomach, and I do suffer from many of them," replied Scrooge. "You may be a bit of undigested beef, or a piece of uncooked potato, or a crumb of cheese, or even a fragment of a toothpick I might have swallowed. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" Hearing this, the ghost let out a frightful cry and shook his chain with such a horrible noise that Scrooge fell to his knees and buried his face in his hands. "Have mercy!" he cried. "I believe in you, yes, but why have you come to me?" "The spirit in every man should walk among his fellow men when he is alive," said the ghost. "But if that spirit does not do so during a man's lifetime, it must do it after his death. The spirit must share the unhappiness on earth that he might have been able to turn to happiness when he was alive." And again the ghost let out a cry and shook his chain. "Why are you chained?" asked Scrooge. "It is a chain I myself made during my life," said the ghost. "I made it, link by link, willingly, just as you are now doing. But your chain, Scrooge, is much longer and much heavier than mine, for yours has grown much these last 7 years. Scrooge looked around him on the floor, half expecting to see yards and yards of iron chains, but he saw nothing. "Jacob," he begged, "Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak to me. Comfort me." "I cannot comfort you, Ebenezer Scrooge," said the ghost. "Comfort is given to other men. Nor can I tell you much more, only that my spirit never thought of my fellow men when I was alive. It never walked among them when I was alive. It never left our office when I was alive, never sought out those creatures I might have helped. So now I am destined to roam throughout the world, never to rest, and never to have peace. For no matter how I misused my life, and no matter how much I regret my selfishness, there is no way for me to make amends." "But you were a good businessman, Jacob," said Scrooge. "Business!" cried the ghost. "My fellow man should have been my business. Charity should have been my business. Mercy, kindness, and generosity should have been my business. And at this time of year I suffer the most, for I remember all the Christmas times I walked through crowds of my fellow men with my eyes down, never looking up to that heavenly star that led the wise men to a stable so long ago." And again he let out a cry. Scrooge began to tremble violently. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly up. I am not allowed to explain to you why you can see me now, but I can tell you that I have sat beside you, invisible, for many and many a day." Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "I am here tonight to warn you, Ebenezer, that you still have a chance of escaping the same fate as mine." "You were always my good friend," said Scrooge gratefully. "Thank you." "You will be haunted by 3 spirits," continued the ghost. "If that is the chance you mentioned, I think I'd rather not." "Without their visits, you cannot avoid the fate I had. You can expect the first spirit tomorrow night at 1 o'clock. "Couldn't they all come at once and let me be done with it, Jacob?" The ghost ignored Scrooge's question. "You can expect the second spirit on the following night at the same time, and the third will come at the last stroke of 12 on the next night. You will not see me any more, Ebenezer, but for your own sake, remember all that I have told you. The ghost backed away from Scrooge. With each step he took, the window raised itself a little, so that by the time the ghost had reached it, it was wide open. He beckoned Scrooge to come to him, and when the two were only a step from each other, Marley's ghost held up his hand. As Scrooge stopped, he heard strange sounds in the air, cries of sorrow and wails of regret. The ghost joined in with these sounds as he floated out through the window and into the dark night. Scrooge rushed to the window and looked out. The air was filled with ghosts wandering every which way, moaning as they floated. Every one of them wore chains. Scrooge recognized one of them as a greedy banker he had known. He was now an old ghost with a huge iron safe attached to his ankle. He was floating over a poor woman sitting out in the cold, an infant in her arms, and he was crying pitifully because he did not have the power to help her. It was a power he did have once, but did not use it when he was alive. Soon the spirits faded away, and Scrooge closed the window. He went to the door through which the ghost had entered and examined it carefully. It was still double locked, as he had fastened it with his own hands earlier. Scrooge was about to say, "Humbug," but he got no further than "hum" when he stopped. Was it because of his conversation with the ghost? Was it because the hour was late? Or was it because he was terrified of his fate? Scrooge did not even bother to take off his dressing gown, but lay down on his bed and fell asleep instantly.